at Hennepin History Museum and developed in collaboration with the museum called Owning Up, Racism and Housing in Minneapolis. That was developed by a couple of students in the Heritage Studies and Public History program, Denise Pike and Casey Lucchini Butcher. And in the course of researching that exhibit and talking to many different community members in South Minneapolis, many people, particularly African-American elders, kept asking us, like, when do we talk about the freeway? And so as Owning Up opened at Hennepin History Museum, the 35W reconstruction project was just getting started. The road was all torn up. And, it struck me and Denise that it probably looked a lot like it looked when it was being built. And wouldn't this be an interesting time to revisit the history of 35W and to have conversations with community members throughout South Minneapolis about that history and about what it's been like to live with 35W in their neighborhoods and sometimes in their front lawns for the past more than 50 years now. So Denise and I decided to kick off this project, which we called A Public History of 35W. And very early on in that project, we discovered the work of Dr. Ernest Lloyd, who you'll meet in a moment. I'll pass it to him next to introduce himself. Dr. Lloyd wrote his dissertation about 35W in South Minneapolis, and we were really inspired by his work. Denise and I sought to make this very much a community engaged project. So other members of the community in South Minneapolis who worked on this project, who I'd like to acknowledge, include Heidi Adelsman, Bruce Bremer, Sterling Rucker, and Cindy Booker, both served as community advisors to the project. Many students, master's students in the Heritage Studies and Public History program, worked on the project as well, including Janine Gilmer, who I see is in the audience, and probably some others. So this is, while Dr. Lloyd and I may often be in the newspaper about this project, it's important to acknowledge that many other people worked on it, and it was very much a team project. And we hope that the interpretations were ones that were shared broadly by community members who we talked to, and their voices and their words and their images in many instances are in the exhibit. So that is what I will say by way of introduction. Once we go around the room of our panelists and they finish introducing themselves, John and I will show you what this interactive element of the exhibit looked like, which is where we're getting some of the questions that we hope to talk about tonight. So with that, Dr. Lloyd, I'll turn it over to you for an introduction.
Thank you. For those who do not know me, I grew up as the son of a Southern sharecropper in North Carolina, experiencing firsthand the inequities my parents faced. And while in college there, I marched with some of the great civil rights leaders of the era, such as Jesse Jackson, Ralph Abernathy, Dr. King's successor following his assassination, Dennis Banks, Russell Means, and other local leaders. It was there that I made the choice to dedicate my life to fighting for civil rights of BIPOC individuals. After receiving my MA degree in history from Iowa State, I moved to Minnesota in 1980 after being recruited to work for the Minnesota Department of Transportation, where I worked for nearly 40 years in various positions, of which 25 of those years served in the Office of EEO Contract Management, now called the Office of Civil Rights. Various positions there, up to the office director and assistant to the commissioner of MnDOT. And while there, it was important for me to ensure that I was working for and be mindful of the individual that I cared about, those BIPOC individuals, minority of women, socially and economically disadvantaged contractors and employees who participate as businesses and employ as trainees in various trades on highway construction projects. It was this job that I cherished the most because it allowed me to be a leader out in front the drum major, as Dr. King calls it, making a fundamental difference in these people's lives. And excuse me. In an industry where they were traditionally omitted from participating. I provided guidance to scholars from the University of Minnesota and community leaders who expanded on my dissertation. They called it a pioneering dissertation. Okay, I settled for that. In 2013, how a route on the interstate highway through South Minneapolis disrupted an African-American neighborhood. My guidance led to the production of a human toe, as Greg just mentioned, a public history of 35W exhibit. The programmatic success of the exhibit is leading to a book project with the University of Minnesota Press, and Dr. Donofrio and I became Hub Residency Engagement Fellows at the U, College of Liberal Arts, and co-editor of the book. I'll pass it over now to Dr. Phillips.
Bonjour. Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Katrina Phillips. I am a citizen of the Red Cliff Band of Lake Superior, Ojibwe. And in case you're out there going, where the heck is Red Cliff? It is about as far north in Wisconsin as you can get before you run into Lake Superior. And so I am from rural northern Wisconsin. I moved to Minneapolis for college, and I have now, I've now lived in Minnesota for just as long as I lived in Wisconsin. That's a little terrifying, but we'll make it work. I have a BA and a PhD in history from the University of Minnesota, both in history. And I'm now an associate professor of history at Macalester College in St. Paul. And so much of my work centers Native history and the history of the American West. I've had the option and the opportunity, I should say, to really get a chance to look into a lot of elements of Twin Cities history, of Minnesota history, particularly as it relates to Native people. And so having the chance to be here and be part of this conversation is really incredible. It's honestly a little humbling to have to follow Dr. Lloyd. And so with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Williams.
Thank you, Dr. Phillips. It is hard to follow Dr. Lloyd, but I think that both of you kind of have established the foundation for this conversation, in that I think all of us come to this work both as scholars, as intellectuals, but also as individuals who recognize the importance of history as existing beyond what is on the printed page. The reality is that we live in a community where there are sites that record not only testimonies to progress, but testimonies to trauma. And I think this project is a very good example of that in terms of what happened with 35W in South Minneapolis. It's great to have this conversation today, in particular, as we close in on the 3rd anniversary of the murder of George Floyd, and we think about George Floyd Square, one of those sites. But at the same time, we can think about the 3rd precinct, we can think about Fort Snelling, we can think about all the work that's done by mapping prejudice and identifying various sites within the city. And we understand that history both lives in the hearts and minds of the survivors, and continues to touch us in those spaces that we don't necessarily have knowledge of, but which speak to us in terms of the injustices that were done and the opportunities that are before us. Dr. Lloyd, you mentioned Dr. King in particular, and I think about his final book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? My work as the founding director of the Racial Justice Initiative at the University of St. Thomas is to sit in those moments where we're starting to try to disentangle how the chaos is what disrupted community to begin with. And so this idea of reconciliation, this desire of many for a tragedy with a happy ending, undermines our ability to sit with the discomfort, the likes of the work that you do, Dr. Lloyd, certainly that Dr. Phillips does, and this distinguished panel this evening. My work with the Racial Justice Initiative at the University of St. Thomas really bottoms on this notion of historical recovery. We can't talk about moving forward. In fact, we can't talk about anything unless we bravely face our history and unflinchingly deal with those sites of trauma, and then think creatively about how to address that in meaningful ways. They can't simply be markers and memorials. They can't simply be the renaming of Lake Calhoun. They have to substantively address in a meaningful way what is left tattooed on landscape, but also in the hearts and minds of people who've survived that injustice. And I'll turn it over to Dr. Donofrio.
Thanks, Dr. Williams. Dr. Cabán, how about you for an introduction?
Yes, thank you. Good evening, and thanks for being here. And I'm really humbled by this invitation to take part of this panel discussion. My name is José Antonio Zayas Cabán. I am originally from Puerto Rico, and I have made my way through the U.S. By way of my education and background in music. I have a terminal degree, doctoral degree in saxophone performance. I still operate as a recording artist. I'll talk about that in a second. But I'm also the advocacy director at Our Streets Minneapolis, where we focus on the past harms of transportation solutions and bringing forward ideas to expand community imagination so that community members can think about the histories that were displayed in this exhibit and how to leverage that history to achieve reparative justice and meaningful change within their communities. So we try to support communities across the Twin Cities and sort of helping them understand what's possible in terms of funding and transportation policy and community benchmarks to make sure that communities that were harmed most or marginalized most or disproportionately harmed by the effects of highway development, for example, and other infrastructure and land use decisions are prioritized moving forward. I've also learned quite a bit as a Mapping Prejudice Project community fellow this year about the connections between racially restrictive covenants, about the dispossession of Native American land, about segregationist practices by land grant institutions and how that has led to the concentration of communities of color and immigrant communities in the same areas where the highways were built, including I-35, but really the entire interstate system across the United States. And that has really helped us as an organization bring forward solutions like the one you see behind me to really kind of holistically address and bring forward ideas for reimagining communities in a way that works for them and uplifting community visioning to make sure that voices are amplified in a way where decision makers, staff are considering what community members actually want, and they're thinking critically about how to respond to centuries of harms in a way that at least starts to, get the ball moving in the right direction. And to kind of close out the introduction, the reason why I got into this work, as a musician, I shifted focus when my home country, Puerto Rico, was hit by 2 hurricanes in 2015 during the Trump administration, and sort of helping advocate and raise awareness about Puerto Rico, which is a protectorate of the United States. And thankful to be sitting here, the culmination of that work. We just released an album last year called The Invisible Nation by Miguel Senon, which was nominated for a Grammy by the Recording Academy. And it was huge recognition of Puerto Rican artists elevating the plight that Puerto Ricans have to sort of go through as a colony of the United States Empire. And so this sort of has brought this together for me in terms of continuing work in advocacy and in music to uplift social issues, leverage history, and engage community members in a way that helps them imagine a better future for themselves.
Right.
Thanks so much for those introductions. Now, John, are you able to queue up slides for us to just do a little show and tell here?
Yep. And while I'm doing that, a couple of housekeeping things that I neglected earlier. This is meant to be an interactive conversation. We've got a nice sized group tonight where there should be plenty of room for all of you who are visitors off of the pinned screens can jump in with your questions or comments. Couple ways to do that. You can do the raise hand thing in Zoom. You can try to jump in if there's a quiet moment. Probably the easiest thing is to hop onto the chat and either put your question there on the chat or say, hey, call on me, please. I've got something to say. And as a note on that, we're recording this as well. We had a number of people say they couldn't make it tonight, but they were interested in the topic. And so we'll be recording the proceedings, and you can just keep that in mind as you're thinking about how you want to participate. But we really hope that everybody who's got good words to say want to jump in and go for that. So here are the slides that Greg is looking for. Is that popping up for folks?
Yeah.
Let me get into slideshow. I think that'll help.
Perfect.
There is our illustrious curator.
Yeah. Now it's a little strange that I'm the model in this photograph, but when the professional photographer came to the museum, there weren't so many people around. So there I am. But what you see here is one of two interactive components of the exhibit. There was one right when you came in the door that asked you, how you got to the museum. Did you walk? Did you ride a bike? Did you take the freeway? And this was obviously meant to help people reflect on their own transportation choices. This interactive component is the second of them, and it's near the end of the exhibit. And there were 4 different Post-it notes, each with a different question, and they each have different colors. So you can see in this photograph the distribution of some of the different colors that represent different questions. So John, on the next slide, we can look at, these are the questions. So question 1 asked, if you were transported back to the 1950s and placed in charge of building a freeway system for the Twin Cities, what would you do differently? Not building is not an option. And here I'll credit one of our community collaborators, Bruce Bremer, with putting that bit on the end. You can't weasel out of this question. You have to confront it, just as people, planners and politicians in the 1950s did. The second question asked, what reparations are needed to repair the damage done by freeways? What more can you tell us about this history was another question. And the final question, how are you affected by freeways today? And again, the idea here was to give viewers of the exhibit, guests of the museum, an opportunity to share their own thoughts about what they had just seen, and to share their insights with us as the creators and researchers of this project. So, we didn't know as the makers of this exhibit if this would be a popular interactive, but it turned out to be. John and his staff at the museum, Hennepin History Museum, transcribed all the Post-it notes and put them into an Excel spreadsheet. And I'm amazed to report that there are at least a couple hundred of them that respond to each 4 of these questions and do so in really thoughtful ways. So tonight, our program is designed, again, to debate some of these questions and to bring people to this panel who can speak to them in a way that some of the curators had less experience or less depth thinking about how are people thinking about reparations today, and what are how are we thinking about modern transportation systems and community engagement around transportation policy and decision making today. So that is how we arrived at this program, and that's how we came to identify with these panelists. And I'm really happy to have them with us tonight to help us answer these questions. So the responses from museum guests really run a pretty wide range. Thanks, John, for sharing those slides. And so, I want to start kind of broadly at first here to ask perhaps Dr. Williams and Dr. Phillips to begin having us think about our reparations due for the construction of freeways, and if they are, to whom are they due? Or is thinking of reparations in the context of freeways, a little too late in the historical narrative to be even thinking about reparations? Should we be thinking further back in time in terms of reparations? Dr. Williams and Dr. Phillips, either one of you want to start us off with thinking about reparations in the context of freeways?
Do you want that first, Dr. Phillips?
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Williams. So one of the things that really strikes me, having had a chance to look at these responses, these questions, and just really seeing not only the wide range of responses, but the biggest thing for me is the number of responses that simultaneously call for both reparations and land back.
Mhm.
And not in a figurative sense either, right? We're not talking like, oh, land acknowledgements, right? For as a little side note, one of the best examples I've seen about kind of the fallacy of land acknowledgements. I actually saw some of my Macalester students do this. They're giving this presentation, and one of my students asked someone in the front row for their water bottle, and so then my student is there with the water bottle. I promise this is not an advertisement for Stanley, but it might as well be. And so my student is like, all right, I acknowledge that I have this water bottle, and now it is my water bottle. And then she just stood there for an awkward amount of time and didn't give the water bottle back. And so when we think about reparations, when we think about land back, I love thinking about those two together, particularly in this context, because that idea of collective response is really crucial, and it's really important because there is such a deep connection here. And one of the things that I find the most striking here, particularly when we're thinking about the construction of highways. I mean, people have done studies on this across the United States. It's not, just unique to Minnesota, is that first we have the dispossession of Native nations from their land.
Yes.
And then we have the later decimation of predominantly Black neighborhoods. And so it's not a singular narrative of dispossession, it is multiple narratives of dispossession. And I think putting these in conversation together makes it that much richer, because it's one thing to kind of separate these pieces out, right? If we think about, oh, well, here in Minnesota, let's just use that as an example. Okay, we have treaties that were signed in, the 1830s, the 1850s. That was then. But then when you jump into the 20th century, you have this subsequent removal and this subsequent dispossession. But this time it's not Native people, it's Black people.
Mhm.
And so putting those in conversation with one another really elongates and really stretches out this history. Because, like I said, you have the dispossession of Native nations that then leads to the further dispossession of Black people in these neighborhoods. And so putting those pieces together is really fascinating. And I think it's helpful, right? Because it really shows that long history that's there.
And to Dr. Phillips' point, I think about 1975 when you have Arthur Cunningham, the head of the Minneapolis NAACP, who makes national headlines in the aftermath of a number of incidents of police brutality, when he says that the Minneapolis police have declared war on Blacks and Indians. That's a direct quote. But what Dr. Phillips is naming here is what that war looks like outside the space of violence committed on Black and brown bodies by police and in other areas of Minnesota life, which are less apparent. In fact, some would argue they're transparent, except for those who are upon who they're acted. And so it's not just that Black and Native people find themselves under assault, physically under assault by the police. It's the fact that those problems are exacerbated by the shrinking of neighborhoods, by the denial of access to places of public accommodation, by the failure of the educational system to address those needs in a way that are culturally responsive. Not that the people aren't capable, but that the systems themselves are built in a way to reify white supremacy. So those things are very powerful in this conversation. In fact, James Baldwin was famous for saying the world changes according to the way people see it. And if you can alter even by a millimeter the way people look at reality, then you can change it. It's really powerful for me to think about this in the context of what's happening in 1959, when there is this moment where federal funding for this project seems to be in jeopardy. And in that moment, you've got the governor of the state of Minnesota, you've got legislators actually calling on people to protest, to engage their civic voice, to make sure that this project is properly funded. At the same time, they're denying Black and brown folks from expressing their concerns about the removal, their erasure from not only this civic discourse, but in reality, the neighborhoods themselves. I share with you very quickly, because I think this is something that when we see it, and it could really make that impact. When we talk about reparations, it's easy. This is from the St. Paul Recorder. It's from 1959. And you have Bailey Thomas and the High and Low writing, a nice Minneapolis family of 4 was displaced by the freeway. They have $20,000 to buy a home, but they can't find any takers because they're colored. That's naming in a very powerful and direct way the problem. But we go one step further to an article that comes out in 1960, the following year, January. And the title of it is A Negro in Morningside. And I want to read part of this to you. The case of this Negro deserves a close, hard look for Minneapolis and its suburbs because it poses a problem which may be repeated many times. The man in question is a biochemist at the Veterans Administration Hospital. He's being displaced by the Freeway Project June 15th. He's married. His wife is a teacher and a social worker. There is one young child. This is the politics of respectability, but the reality is we have to talk about the people who are displaced who don't fit this model, because that's as important. Those are the George Floyds in this conversation, which bring this full circle, that erasure that we talked about. Second part of this, I think, is really interesting. They say it's estimated that 8,000 Minneapolis families may be displaced by the interstate freeway system during the next 10 years. They talk about those projects, but they say, but the Negro must usually surmount high walls of prejudice, and he faces these walls regardless of his economic status or the cultural and educational levels to which he's attained. The case of the Negro family displaced by the freeways and seeking a home in Morningside will probably be duplicated many times in the next few years. The circumstances will vary and other white communities will be involved, but the essential question will remain the same. And I read that question today because this question was repeated over and over in the reflections offered by people who walk through the 35W exhibit. You see it in those who are responding to the question about reparations, about the history, and it is, are we mature enough to judge African Americans as individuals, accepting or rejecting him as a neighbor on the basis of merit only, or having forced a Black family from its home? Shall we then forbid its entry to our white neighborhood? Shall we make mere whiteness rather than human decency the critical test of the good neighbor? I read this in a moment where we're talking about, books like Ibram Kendi, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and Robin DiAngelo, White Fragility. And those questions are being raised in 1960 in language that's unfamiliar to us, but at the core, they're the same questions. And the article concludes, probably the most important part, these are some of the questions to which Morningside is now addressing itself. Its answers to them will help in measure to determine the response of the whole metropolitan area to the problem of the displaced Negro. But the problem wasn't of the displaced Black folks. The problem was with a system that denied them voice in the first place and contributed to the erasure, the likes of which Dr. Phillips was describing in terms of that connection between Indigenous and Black. That the question of reparations is very complicated if we deal with it in a nuanced way that Professor Phillips is talking about. When you talk about that Morningside family and the $20,000 for a home to restore it, but to whom? Whose land and what place and what's the ultimate outcome that we seek in that more mature conversation and not the legalistic conversation that you got in some of those comments where people, well, they should have paid people more for their homes. That would not have corrected the injustice. Yeah. The injustice lay in the dispossession of the land itself. And that's a much broader conversation, a historical conversation, historical question that requires us to be more mature and also more thoughtful in the way that we engage with it.
Thanks so much for that, Dr. Williams. I'm going to pass to Dr. Cabán in just a moment, but first of all, I want to acknowledge that a descendant of that story that you just shared is with us in the audience tonight. I won't name them. They can identify themselves if they'd like to later. Just to give a little bit of update, the Minnesota Highway Department estimated that 24,000 people were displaced by freeway construction in Minneapolis, and between 6,000 and 7,000 in St. Paul. And in 1960, 24,000 people was 1 in every 20 people in Minneapolis, which is just an absolutely astounding figure of displacement, a magnitude of displacement to consider. So, okay, with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Cabán.
Yeah, so I want to add a few things to the thoughts that we just heard, in terms of the period of dispossession and then the period of sort of removal and destruction to make way for the highways. Just to give credit to Kirsten Delgard and the team at Mapping Prejudice Project, they teach us a lot about how the sort of evolution and development of the 20th century modern real estate project was really kind of a project to deal with mixing of races and ethnicities and sort of disrupt that process. And in the state of Minnesota, between 1910 and 1950, these racially restrictive covenants built into these deeds was sort of creating a real estate market that was forcing immigrant communities, BIPOC communities into these areas where then they were intentionally selected for displacement, redlining, highway construction. And the reason why I had to bring that up, in the context of reparations and creating a climate where people can climb out of the situations that they were put into, both in terms of being displaced, but also the destruction of cultural vibrancy, the destruction of that deep sense of community and history that sort of developed over time. Because, for example, in our organization, we do advocacy around highway conversions or highway removal, if you may. And a lot of people start with that conversation asking about, well, what's going to happen to these vehicles? And some of the invisible harms that we like to bring up that sort of emerge from the point where now communities are displaced, the highways are in place, is also that the communities that are surrounding the highways that are left with nowhere to go now are experiencing some of the worst life expectancy, some of the highest asthma rates, developmental issues because of the pollution. They're also in the hottest parts of the Twin Cities. So they're breathing the worst air. They often are the same people who cannot afford to purchase or own cars. And so when we talk about the idea of the turn back to sort of return the right of way to the community and an opportunity to redevelop it, it's also an opportunity for communities to kind of imagine a future where they can sort of at least take a small stab at the opportunity to live in the way that was afforded to people who moved to areas that were protected by those covenants. They didn't have to live by the highways. They lived by the nice lakes. They had a lot of amenities. Things were sort of walkable in the communities. They're also the recipient of the highest amount of capital investment improvements by both the cities. And so while there's a concentration of privilege and wealth in these areas, the term we sometimes like to use, I stole this from Chris Hedges, it's called economic warehousing. These other communities that are near the highways, they're trapped by pollution, they're trapped economically, and they have no way of achieving upward mobility. They have no real way of achieving the same kind of health and economic outcomes as the communities have been benefiting from these privileges protected by these covenants for a century. And so the idea of returning that land back and returning that right away isn't just about changing the modes of transportation, which obviously would help reduce carbon emissions, but also it's just to create an opportunity for communities to start thinking about self-determination in a way that's beneficial to them. And so just one last thing I wanted to add, is that oftentimes when we talk about these kinds of reparations, we know that when nice and shiny things come to communities, gentrification follows and other kinds of displacement follows, speculation follows, prices skyrocket, and then these same communities that were harmed once, they're forced to move again into a different location. And so it's critically important and something that obviously that's important to our work, to think about it holistically, like it's been suggested here, that things have to move together at the same time. And obviously an infrastructure project creates that opportunity to think about it holistically, but those protections also have to be in place because there's sort of a scale that's been away for a couple of centuries, a century, 50 years, 70 years, where in terms of overcoming these economic disparities, it's not something that happens overnight. It's something that needs to happen over time. But in addition to sort of near-term solutions, long-term, in order for these communities to achieve the things that have never been afforded to them for 2, 3, 4, 5 generations, I guess in my view, bare minimum, it's creating the space and opportunity for them to rebuild things sort of in their image and replace things and replace our community with an infrastructure that really works for cultural, economic vibrancy to really start to tap into the possibility of repairing any harms.
Thanks so much for these thoughts and responses. I want to draw Dr. Lloyd into the conversation and piggyback off of something that Dr. Williams and Dr. Cabán said about cultural erasure. And it's not just, you can't just compensate people more for the loss of their homes. Dr. Lloyd, you spoke with some elders who 15 years ago or more, when you were researching and writing your pioneering dissertation, you spoke to people, elders who were adults who lost their homes to the freeway or were, knew many other African-American elders who had lost their homes to the freeway. And they spoke about life on what they knew as the South Side of Minneapolis, which was this middle-class African-American community. And I wonder if you could say, share with us what they told you about what was lost to the freeway. It wasn't just people's homes. I mean, those were lost too, but it was something more than that.
Thank you. Interesting enough to me at that time was they wanted to talk. The elders wanted to talk. They weren't afraid to talk. They want their voice to be heard somehow in the dissertation or what have you. They wanted to be heard. And they said to me a few things. One, we came from various areas of the country, down in the South, escaping racism, political oppression, lynching, discrimination of all sorts. You can imagine what I'm talking about. To come to what they call the promised land. And within this promised land, they were saying to themselves, we have finally made it. We are here. Minnesota is a place for us to be. This South Side is a place for us to be. Beautiful homes, nice neighbors, nice school system, a safe neighborhood. We could leave our doors open all night and not worry about anything. But they also said to me something that was interesting more than anything else to me, was that when they were here, they had nice jobs. They were educated. They were engineers. They were doctors. There were teachers. There were scientists. The same type of individual classification-wise that the white were doing. So they felt they blended right into this interracial community where they all were the same. Only difference was the color of their skin. But other than that, we fit right in here. It's a nice place to live. And lo and behold, they looked out the window one day and they saw a bulldozer coming in, pushing down the trees, and with all that noise and fumes and what have you. And then they also said, we didn't know this was happening. But one elder said to me, it's already done. It's already done years ago. But yet my community, at least we didn't, by the color of our skin, didn't know what was going on, even though we were connected politically, even though we was educated people, even though we read the newspaper, even though we did all of these things. Why did they bring it to our neighborhood? And going further with this, if I may, Greg, going further with this, they said to me, once the construction began, they knew at that time we're no stopping to it. No matter what they said I want to do, it could not be stopped. The railroad was moving nonstop. They dug that trench. They called it a trench. On both sides of the freeway, of that trench, they had friends. So some of their friends used to use their flashlight at night to signal one another time to go to bed. Use their flashlight to give their own secret code that I see you in the morning, I see you in school. But before, they can just go from door to door to their friends. And then they went on to tell me that once everything was said and done, the road was through, the highway department would tearing up homes and moving home as far away as Albert Lee. We got no place to go. Where are we going? They don't want us in the suburban area. They don't want us out this so-called block, they called it. They thought they was bitched into the construction zone, no way to get out of it. But they knew one thing they had themselves to rely upon, to maintain that sense of fellowship, that sense of community, that sense of belonging. But now, we're Biden signing the infrastructure bill, the $1.2 trillion bill a year or so ago. Now they're saying that, I'm pretty sure the people are saying to this very day, here we go again. Where's all this money going to? What is going to happen? You're going to be business as usual? I posed that same question to Nancy Darbenberger, the commissioner of MnDOT, back in December. I said to her unequivocally, and she listened very attentively, that what are you going to do with this money when it comes through? How are you going to handle the concern that took place 55, 60 years ago and put it in today's world? What model are you going to use? Are you going to use the Our Streets Minneapolis model? Or are you going to use the CAP freeway model that can run Joe? Or are you going to use the combination of both between the Twin Cities area? You know that 94 needs to be redone. So what manner or what phase of this construction would you lean toward? She didn't give me any answer. She nodded in affirmatively that she understands what I was saying. I said, I'm pretty sure you have been hearing from all sides, the rich, the poor, the BIPOC. So you have a job to do. And I said to her that, just want you to know, the community will be looking and engaging to understand what role the Minnesota Department of Transportation will take in trying to solve this problem of rebuilding the interstate highway system in the 7-county metropolitan area.
Thanks, Dr. Lloyd. Thanks for speaking with and speaking for the elders who, all the elders you spoke with about being impacted by 35W have since passed on. So it's so important that you give voice to what they told you. I want to read a comment. I'm not sure that all of you can read comments that are in the chat. You might be on a phone, so I'm going to read a comment. Hi all, my name is Courtney Taylor. I'm a descendant of the Black family who was just mentioned and quoted in the Star Tribune. My family's history was also part of the exhibit, which was on the back wall of the exhibit. And I'd love to learn more about how to hold the city accountable for paying reparations to Black communities displaced and impacted by the construction of 35W freeway. What power players should be contacted and what community organization and allies are available to assist with grassroots efforts? There have been multiple reparations programs launched in various cities such as Portland, Oregon, Manhattan Beach, California, Seattle, Washington, Evanston, Illinois, and most notably, Rondo, Minnesota. And I would like for similar actions to be launched for South Minneapolis. I'd like to ask Dr. Phillips and Dr. Williams to respond to this question if they would. And I would just like to take a moment to thank Courtney Taylor and her father, Greg Taylor, for sharing photographs and stories and letters from their parents and grandparents, Marion and Mary Taylor. they made the exhibit, so much more powerful, and they helped us interpret it in a way that was meaningful and true to them, which was not necessarily the way I interpreted it initially. So thank you, Courtney Taylor, for your time and generosity, and the Taylor family. Dr. Williams.
It's a great question. And I think, I was on the committee, the St. Paul Reparations Recovery Committee in St. Paul that was commissioned by the City Council in St. Paul that took a vote to deal with the historical injustice directed against African descendants of chattel slavery in St. Paul. A lot of people think about it as just being Rondo, but we interpreted our mission to be much broader than Rondo and talked about a range of other injustices committed on African Americans in particular, American descendants of chattel slavery in particular, and that language is important in order to explore the possibility for reparations. At the same time we were doing our work, Mayor Melvin Carter also began exploring ways to address this issue of historic injustice, and that is focused more narrowly on Rondo. I would say to Courtney, which is such a great question, I think part of this is a question of political will, because the device used to dispossess those homeowners of their property was eminent domain. And as a concept, that means that there is no accountability or reparations you could demand directly, because there's a legal process which was followed, which would forestall you from making a case that somehow it wasn't fair. There was consideration and compensation and so on and so forth. And so you can talk about how it wasn't unjust. You can say that it wasn't enough, but to go back and revisit that process itself would be difficult. The question of reparations then has to originate in a space very similar to St. Paul, where the city and state are taking ownership for what happened and in thinking creatively about ways to compensate the victims of that injustice. That can be done directly in terms of, and this is what you saw or you hear often with regard to Rondo, can you identify the families who were dispossessed? Can you set a fair market value for those homes? And then can you ask for compensation to make up for the injustice that was done in terms of the unfair levels of compensation? And then there are broader conversations that get to what Dr. Lloyd was talking about. What about the other corollary harm that's done by virtue of the fact of the denial of access to education and the inability to build intergenerational wealth, and the ancillary harm that came from not being able to send your child to college because you didn't have access to a home that you could mortgage that would then allow, or not even mortgage, just intergenerational wealth that you could sell that would enable you to do those things, or property that you could pass down. And so reparations becomes a very complicated but important question, because part of it is, and when you ask specifically about what allies, if you're thinking, there have been efforts at this, conversations around this in Minneapolis, but I think you have to, I look to the St. Paul model, at least in terms of Minnesota, as being very effective. Can you get Mayor Frey and other elected officials within Minneapolis to take this on? Members of the city council who might be sympathetic, who might be looking across the river at St. Paul and saying, how come we haven't taken this on? We have our own Rondo story, which is documented at human toll. We have other ways to think about this. And we have an advantage on St. Paul in some sense, because we've got human toll. So we've got the exhibit here, although there's plenty of research on Rondo and injustice in the city of St. Paul. And then secondly, I would, just to be very specific, I think Traren Cruz would be a great person to reach out to, Nick Muhammad, individuals who were instrumental for years in raising the issue of reparations with the St. Paul, within the city of St. Paul. I'm trying to build kind of political will around taking this question on, bringing together a diverse group of community leaders and young people to make the case for why we needed to do this. And then really thinking creatively about, and this is what I was so happy about, at least in terms of St. Paul, when those recovery funds came up, there are ways that we can be very creative in thinking about how to address that injustice that would create the accountability, but also the acknowledgement of the harm that's done. Because accountability or compensation without acknowledgement would be problematic. I think a big part of this is what Dr. Lloyd spoke to in terms of, and this is where you get some of the pushback when you start having conversations about reparations. People automatically start bringing up the comparative grandmother story. My family were immigrants and so on and so forth, and they encountered the same discriminatory practices, but they weren't dealing with a system of entrenched racial discrimination, which has had generational impact. And so you can document that. You can think about ways that you can compensate for that. But I think the bigger question is what I've learned from scholars like Katrina Phillips, and certainly from community activists like Jim Bear Jacobs. And Dr. Lloyd spoke to this too. The emotional healing that has to take place, you can't put a dollar sign on. There has to be education. There has to be documentation. There has to be an acknowledgement. And it can't be empty in the way that Dr. Phillips talked about it with the water bottle discussion. The first way you address that emptiness is by assessing an amount, something that can be paid to those families. But you recognize that that payment, that debt is not satisfied by virtue of the fact that you've, we paid $15,000 or $20,000 for this home. And so it would be worth X today, and we're going to give you that. That doesn't even begin to address the kind of fundamental harm that's done. It simply answers one aspect of that. There's also the element of this, which we ran into St. Paul, and as they're now moving into the next phase of that work, will be a big part of that work. How do you then ensure that this doesn't happen again? Because we recognize with the way that white supremacy operates, that those systems and that mindset is still in place, and we can document that in a million ways in our community today, in terms of housing, in terms of education, in terms of access to city services and public accommodation. This has to be bigger than, although this is difficult for the families because there's a direct harm that's justiciable that you can point to. My family was harmed by this policy, this practice, this procedure. But then there's also the larger question of how are we continuing to be harmed by virtue of the mindset and those policies, practices, and procedures that continue unabated in our community. So I hope that does it justice. I'm happy to talk to you offline. But again, I would look to St. Paul as the model. I think you had Councilperson Jane Prince and others in St. Paul who are huge advocates for this. A number of us who had the experience of working on that committee to set what will be a permanent reparations committee in St. Paul that will be looking into this issue. And so we've got some resources right here in Minnesota that you can look to for answers in that regard.
Thanks, Dr. Williams, for those insights and leads. Dr. Phillips, anything you want to add to that?
So I don't admittedly have, the tangible responses and resources that Dr. Williams does. But I think what's most striking to me in the comments that he made were these ideas of acknowledgement and accountability. Because without either one of those, there is no next step. And I think one of the few benefits here with that is almost that like power of immediacy, right? It's very easy, unfortunately, it's very easy to point to these folks, right? Who are still here, whose descendants are right here. Right. And I think and one thing that I kept thinking about as Dr. Williams was sharing those thoughts is when we think about reparations, when we think about land back, it's also very targeted. And one of the best examples that I can have is, quite honestly, the Black Hills. I mean, there's the amount of money sitting in that fund is astronomical by now. But the people do not want the money. They want their land back. And on some level, and again, that's again part of what Dr. Williams is talking about, right? Where it's like, how does that happen? What are those next steps? How is that even a thing, in a sense, right? How do you make that happen? And I think, again, that the power of acknowledgement, the power of accountability, the power of community organization. And, one of the best ones, obviously, that comes to mind is, Reconnect Rondo, all of this great work that they're doing that Dr. Williams pointed to. But it is really striking, right, to think about the lingering aspects of historical trauma and, the great work that's been done on historical trauma and historical unresolved grief. And I think so much of that is tied to what, my fellow panelists have been talking about. When you think of the adverse health effects, when you think of I mean, you can even tie that to, you know, barriers to education. All of these barriers that are put up are all they're all pieces to this puzzle as a whole. And so, like I said, I don't have, you know, quite the concrete names and organizations to bring to this, but I hope that just by kind of broadening that conversation out a little bit, it's a tangible recognition, right, of that lasting and of that lingering trauma and what it means for the survivors and the descendants.
Thanks, Dr. Phillips. I appreciate that. I want to address a comment that John Crippen made in the chat. He's reflecting on the comments made in the exhibit, and many of them point to this issue of this shouldn't happen again. John writes, there are many comments in the exhibit that demand that future highway projects do better, and a fair amount of cynicism, anger that those projects aren't going down that path. In other words, you know, a lot of fear and cynicism that modern transportation planners or infrastructure planners, even more broadly, aren't going to do better than they did in the past in the 1950s and 60s. And Dr. Lloyd, we can come to you in a second, but let's start with Dr. Cabán. How can you respond to that question about, you know, we're not doing any better? Do you think that's true?
Well, in a way, yes, is the short answer. And I think that to kind of refer back to some of the things that we have to think about in our work, but frame it more broadly. As a nonprofit organization that's talking about reparative justice through transportation infrastructure projects, we feel that we shouldn't have to exist in the first place. You know, the Minnesota Department of Transportation has the resources to engage communities on a level where they can decide for themselves what is it that they want to see happen. And so part of the reason why we kind of exist, we work on Olson Memorial Highway in North Minneapolis, and we work on the 7.5-mile corridor of I-94 that's due for reconstruction, is because a lot of the highway infrastructure across the country is coming to the end of its useful life. And so this transportation bill isn't just timely, it's intentional to kind of address the issue that it's time to think about what to do with all of these highways, interconnected highways across the country. And you know, what I'd like to introduce is that departments of transportation, local jurisdictions and departments of public works know this very well, but this is a once in a generation opportunity to think about life without freeways, that they don't have to exist. There are other ways for people to get around. And more than that, I think Dr. Williams was talking a little bit about the initial investment, the federal debt that was utilized to build a highway system across the country. Highways don't generate any revenue, but conversions and repurposing that land and giving that land back to the community can also help revitalize economies if they're redeveloped. And part of the reason why we specifically advocate for highway removals is because it's more comprehensive, it's more holistic than, you know, perhaps doing a highway mitigation project. And also, if we're thinking about, again, the comparison that I was making earlier, communities that were allowed to live in neighborhoods that were full of amenities that were selected for whites only, they never had to live with the climate impacts of the highways for 6 decades. So we feel very strongly that why not take this opportunity to not only redevelop and connect all of these neighborhoods. For example, in I-94, it's 7.5 miles that's due for reconstruction. Why not reconnect all of the neighborhoods along the highway corridor, but also why not talk to the community about the possibility, as it's been done tens of times in the US and other places around the world, of converting the highway altogether, filling in the trench, reconnecting the neighborhoods with a surface level boulevard. And then not only are you addressing the issue of land, the issue of economy, the issue of reconnecting these neighborhoods, you're also eliminating the biggest source of carbon emissions that is poisoning these communities. So when we're talking about equity and achieving equity, across the landscape, there's no way to make up for that lost time, those centuries of privilege. But at least we can say, hey, why can't these people live in communities where they breathe the same quality air? Because and why can't these communities have the same sort of environment where people don't have to struggle with life expectancy, which is also disproportionately always affecting African-American communities in the Twin Cities and across the country. And the only way to get there is by removing the primary source of those emissions, which is vehicular traffic. And this also leads to the other question, well, what about electrification? Well, it goes back to the same problem, is that we still have a population that cannot afford to own cars. So in spite of the fact that electric vehicles are not coming fast enough and they won't help us solve the climate crises, it's an intersection of climate and economic impacts that's kind of an issue. It's like, we want to make sure that a holistic solution, or we introducing communities to the idea of a holistic solution so they can think critically about something that impacts them directly and materially, those kitchen table issues, and that everyone has equal access across abilities. So if you're a disabled person that's been impacted and you live along the highway corridor, now you have a way to comfortably get around and go to work. Or you can choose not to drive and start walking because the neighborhood is redeveloped. But if you're a person that has, like we often meet when we're doing canvassing, who has all of their children have asthma problems or there are other developmental issues, you don't have to worry about that anymore. And the other point that I wanted to make about this and this connection about whether or not we're doing enough or not, this is where I think advocacy sort of intersects really well with this research and leveraging this research in empowering and informing communities. Often marginalized communities also lack the resources to come up with these ideas themselves. We often encounter the question of like, well, did this come from community or not? Well, if you're struggling and you can't pay rent and you're trying to make multiple jobs, you don't necessarily have the time or the resources to come up with a highway removal project and ignite a fire within your community and all of a sudden create a movement that can overwhelm an entity like the Minnesota Department of Transportation, which has billions of dollars at hand. And so it's also this idea of how to go into communities to expand their imagination about what's possible and resource them so they can start to think about how to advocate for themselves and amplify those voices. Because otherwise it is truly unfair if you're framing it around reparations, if you're framing it around whether these agencies are doing enough, to expect community members to pick themselves up after centuries of disproportionate impacts. And so, to kind of put that all together, we also just have to think about the bottom lines. There's a huge lithium industry that's growing, and these are intersecting commodities at the national level. So lithium sourcing means that we're going to get more batteries for vehicles. They need a commodity to drive on, which is highways. And so what's the profit motive for an entity like the Minnesota Department of Transportation? Highway expansion. And we have to be honest with ourselves about that point of departure to make sure that we're addressing it in a way that's honest with ourselves, honest with the community, and honest about their interests. It used to be called the Highways Department, now it's the Department of Transportation. But by and large, what they're good at is building highways and expanding them. And so it doesn't necessarily just do to think about what they'd like to do or what they're considering. It's important for there to be always an engagement from the community as much as possible to let them know the direction that they want to move into. And that's sort of, striking that balance between the existing system and disrupting it in a way that leads to tangible outcomes.
Thanks so much, Dr. Cabán. Dr. Lloyd, I know you've been reflecting a lot about your on your experience working for MnDOT recently, thinking about writing about this experience. And over many conversations between you and me, you've talked about it being an almost exclusively white place when you arrived. I want to reflect on a comment made by Dr. Williams, thinking about reparations holistically. And I don't know if this is reparations, but it's systemic change. When we think about, are things changing? Are things being done the same way? I want to ask you, from your perspective, having worked as a Black man in MnDOT for nearly 40 years, like, would it matter if more people of color, if there was more BIPOC representation at the agency that builds transportation in Minnesota? How might things be different in your perspective?
My father used to say, if you could continue to do what you always done, you're going to forever get what you always gotten. So going back to what Dr. Spahn was saying, is a difference needs to be made. And working at MnDOT, you work with a lot of engineers. It's a highly technical organization. The engineers are smart, need to be. They're sharp, they should be. But at the same time, I think it's important, as you so eloquently mentioned, Greg, that you have to represent the people that you serve. You have to ensure that you are hiring BIPOC engineers. I keep saying we at MnDOT. I've been gone for 6 years now. I'm still saying we, but at the same time, BIPOC engineers need to be hired more so than ever. You need to ensure that the organization is doing very well with women engineers, but not very well with technical BIPOC, African American, Native American, brown engineers. So I'm saying this: you have to ensure that you're marching to the right drum. You have to ensure, I call it speaking truth to power. Truth for me, you're going to tell it like it is, like I did. Power is, they took away from me. But at the same time, I never start speaking the truth, because you can't just go to the University of Minnesota or to North Dakota State University and hire engineers. You have to go down south, further west, Chicago, St. Louis, Kansas City, places like that, Cincinnati, to ensure that you are engaging in a more larger pool of engineers. So you can bring those back to your organization, make them a part of your organization, put those people in position of power, of authority over time, so that they can give you the other side of the equation. Right now, to be honest, I'm just telling the truth as it is. I was there for all these years. I made my living there. I raised my family working there. But at the same time, and speaking the truth, I do not think, though, this organization is doing enough categorically to ensure that a fair representation of people of color are hired in those technical positions. Not, let's say snowplow driving. That's a good profession, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about people who wear suits and ties to work every day. I'm talking about people who attend all the managerial meetings that the organization give across the state. I'm talking about people that can make those decisions to tell their counterpart, I don't think they're going down the right road, and not afraid to say it, not worried about repercussions if they do say it. Now I'm talking about these same Black and brown and indigenous people who have been traditionally left outside of the mainstream of promotional opportunity at the organization. And I know we have a African American resource group. I believe Mr. Jesse Johnson is online tonight. I believe he is. Jesse heard this from me before. I tell Jesse to speak truth to power himself. Tell the commissioner when she's wrong, she's wrong. Tell the commissioner that we need to do better with the population of people. Tell the governor we need to do better with these pockets of people. Continue to do what's always done. You're going to get what you got before. And Dr. Cabán mentioned it so clearly. This money is coming in now. So how are we gonna build, how are we gonna rebuild the interstate highway system? How are we gonna do it? Are we gonna do it with the same old people? Not in a negative way, I'm saying this, but it's the same, white male engineers, now white male female engineers. Or we gonna do it with everybody else to make them feel like they're a part of doing something different to reconstruct the aging interstate highway system in and around the Twin Cities area. Will MnDOT stop building highway? No. Will MnDOT, they have to reconstruct the existing highway. How are they going to do it? Well, how are they going to do that? And what method would it be done? Are you going to start to reroute all traffic around the Twin City area and start bringing that traffic back into the city? That's what Our Streets Minneapolis is talking about. Uproot them, make them have a boulevard system, make it walkable community, get rid of all this emission, the gas emission that damaging the ozone layer. Make it so that the elderly can feel comfortable riding on their buses back and forth in the boulevard area. To ensure that everybody now contributing. Everybody is contributing, the age, the elderly, the senior, the children, the women, everybody contributing to a more holistic transportation network system. But it won't be done unless changes is made at the top of the organization. Now, if you continue to place all white male and now a lot of white female at the top of the organization, that is good. I'd like to see women advance to the highest level in our organization. But I'm also saying right now to the Commissioner of Transportation, she's listening now, I think her staff is, I'm also saying, don't forget about the rest of the people. We have yet to have, for the most part, African American engineer at the top level at MnDOT. So when is that going to take place? Change that needs to be made at the top before any other change at the bottom can be even identified as being making a difference.
Thanks for sharing those insights, Dr. Lloyd. I appreciate that. I want to address a question in the chat from Dave Bowman, who says, it seems I've heard more attention progress being directed to 94 restoring Rondo than 35W South Minneapolis. True? If so, why? I'll take a first stab at this, but if any of our other panelists want to chime in too, I'd appreciate it. I want to credit the incredible work of Mr. Marvin Anderson and the people of Rondo, who have, literally since the freeway was being rammed through their community, have sought to preserve stories of Rondo, have sought to record who was directly affected, what it meant to their community, what Rondo was, and how it operated. It's been an incredible 50 or more year long project. I think of it as a kind of public memory project, and it has many different components. It's an archive of oral histories and photographs at Hallie Q. Brown Community Center. It's a commemorative plaza on the edge of the freeway. It's Rondo Days, which this 30-year festival now of celebration of a community that for all intents and purposes was tried to be destroyed. So I think it's to the great credit of the people of Rondo and the Rondo community that we talk about it, that we remember it, that many of people you just meet on the street, you can say, have you ever heard of the effects of highway construction in Minnesota? And they say, yes, I know about Rondo. They'll know something about it. They know the name. So, I can also tell you that among scholars who study freeway construction across the United States, many books that are written about it, many of them mention Rondo. It's one of these communities that, as a scholar, you are compelled to mention. So, I think that's one of the reasons. I think it's also true that the way freeway construction affected the African American communities in Rondo versus the South Side was different. Rondo was a kind of direct hit right to the middle of the community, affected both hundreds of residents and many businesses. And in 35W, this is a story we are just still piecing together on an individual level. Black households were certainly displaced. However, it seems to have acted more, and Dr. Lloyd's research and our collective research speaks to this. 35W acted more as a racial dividing line between the integrated neighborhood of the South Side on the east side of what would become 35W, and whiter and more resourced, wealthier communities on the west side of what would become 35W. And we're writing about this now as part of the project. It's interesting as Dr. Phillips and Dr. Williams mentioned that so many of the comments left in the exhibit by visitors said, we should just find the people who lost homes and compensate them appropriately. Well, I can identify with that as a solution of sorts. It turns out they're very difficult to identify. So the Minnesota Highway Department 60 years ago, when it built these freeways, didn't have to record the races of anybody who was displaced, and they didn't have to indicate where people went. So all we have is their names. And then it has been part of our research project to try to then figure out, by going back to earlier census records, like, well, what can we find out about these people? How old were they? What race were they? What were their educations? What did they do for work? And then once we know that information, we've then sought to figure out, by looking at city directories, well, where did they move after they were displaced? And we have done this for a segment of South Minneapolis along 2nd and Stevens, which is where the Free 35W was built, between 38th and 46th, which was the center of the old South Side, where most African Americans lived. And we are still doing the GIS analysis on this. We've just finished a part of it. And our hypothesis was that white people displaced by 35W moved essentially wherever they wanted to, and that Black families who were displaced by 35W really only had one of a few neighborhoods that they could move to. And we suspected that, as was reported in the newspaper at the time in the 50s and 60s, that they moved to the South Side. They moved to other locations, that they struggled to find housing in neighborhoods of Minneapolis that were already considered Black or integrated. And our early results indicate that is exactly what happened, with only 2 exceptions. One of whom is Courtney Taylor's family, who moved to what is now Edina, and another one who seems to have moved north of the city. But they were really the exceptions. Most African Americans had great difficulty finding another place to live, and almost all of them moved to another location just a few blocks away. The difference between the mobility of Black families and white families is astonishing. It is just as we expected it would be. So, I think that just speaks to some of the difference. Dr. Lloyd, do you have any other thoughts about the difference of, like, why are we talking so much about Rondo but not about South Minneapolis and the South Side yet? Or are we just starting to talk about it?
We're just getting started to talk about it, for sure. And with our work and with my dissertation, we talked about back in the 60s when Rondo first started talking about what happened to them. And although 35W came through a few days after that, so to speak, but like you said, the impact wasn't as significant. But I've always argued, even in my dissertation, if one Black person got displaced, that went too many. But looking from a holistic perspective again, the volume over there in with Rondo, with that core Black community right there, and with the community in South Side, Minneapolis, split, but the racial dividing line, they bounce back a lot quicker, if you will.
Yeah.
Perhaps because of their highly educated. I'm not saying that they weren't educated in Rondo at all, but in South Minneapolis, what I found, though, they could bounce back so quickly because they were highly educated and had that track record of success behind them. But nonetheless, though, if you are boxed in into a zone by redlining and 35W. I don't care how much education you got, if you're Black, you're boxed in.
Yeah.
So that was a significant difference at that time. But it was the Blackness of those individuals, not the education or the wealth, the Blackness.
Thank you, Dr. Lloyd. I want to go a little bit off script, or actually a lot off script here, to turn to somebody, one of our audience members, Peter Wiginius, who has written a couple comments here in the chat about the proposed expansion of I-94 and Highway 252 through North Minneapolis and Brooklyn Center. Peter, I know you've been thinking about transportation policy and transportation issues for a long time. Would you mind introducing yourself and sharing us a little bit about this project? This is arguably one of these examples where maybe things aren't changing much. So Peter, over to you.
Sure, I appreciate that so much, and I really appreciate this part of the conversation in particular, recognizing communities that suffer from not only the ongoing effects of past harms, but also the ongoing effects of ongoing harms, which is what you have when it comes to air pollution and the health impacts from air pollution. A case in point is the proposed expansion of Highway I-94 through North Minneapolis and 252 through Brooklyn Center and a portion of Brooklyn Park. I put in the chat a group called the Highway 252 Safety Task Force. I don't claim to be the best representative of their work, but I encourage you to check out the website. I'll put that in the chat again. There's a woman in that organization, a longtime resident of Brooklyn Center named Nahid Khan, who has spoken up really passionately, really effectively on behalf of her community in opposition to the expansion. And so I would encourage people to take a look at that. In one particular regard, I think it's worth noting, this is a local example of a nationwide phenomenon where there's a weaponizing of concerns over safety to suggest that there's only one possible answer to safety concerns. Namely, if you have a highway with stoplights, like 252, well, the solution is to get rid of the stoplights and make it a freeway. Is that the only solution? That's not what we see around the country. And by the way, when they eliminate the stoplights, they also eliminate the transit service that is along those places where the buses can come off the road and serve people. And Nahid and her group have been making suggestions like, well, maybe we could slow down the traffic instead of speeding it up. A common rule with safety is you can design a road for speed or you can design a road for safety, but you can't do both because speed is the opposite of safety. And so anyway, I've said enough about that. I just wanted to make sure that this project, which hasn't gotten as much attention, gets some attention within this group, and appreciate being able to bring that to your attention. I'll put the link in the group link in the chat one more time.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for sharing that with us, Peter. Anyone one of our panelists want to respond or add to that at all? Anything more to say?
Yeah, I'll just add one thing about that, in terms of when I was talking about earlier, once in a lifetime chance to rethink the possibility of whether or not we can live without the highways. The opposite is also true. If highways are expanded, these communities have to live with them for another generation. And so when Peter's talking about, and when we're talking about raising awareness and addressing these issues and speaking up about it, these are generational outcomes. And so things like highway impacts and the way they've been harming communities and the climate and their health and economic impacts, that's really something to consider, is that whatever happens, we're going to have to live with that until our kids take over.
Thanks for that. I want to share one kind of historical fact about freeway construction in the Twin Cities as a transition towards wrapping up and asking you all, if there are panelists, if there are final thoughts you want to share about this. But what I'll share with you is that this is still astonishing to me as somebody who's been digging into this history for 3 or 4 years now, that the Interstate Highway Act of 1956 required one public meeting prior to construction of freeway projects. So there was one public meeting for 94, and there was one public meeting for 35W. These meetings there are full transcripts to them. You can read them. The Minnesota Department of Transportation Library just scanned and made digitally available. Thank you for doing that, Minnesota Department of Transportation Library. The hearing transcripts for 94 and 35W. Believe it or not, I would say a total for both meetings that took place in 1957, a total of about 25 people stood up to give comments, total. Now, again, in South Minneapolis alone, 50 square blocks of mostly residential houses properties were demolished to build 35W between 94 and 62. 24,000 people in Minneapolis, 6,000 or 7,000 people in St. Paul were displaced. A total of something like 25 people stood up to give comments. You know, I was born in the bicentennial. I did not live through the 50s and 60s. I don't kind of understand what that period was like and how people, you know, related to government and maybe had a different sense of trust in government. But, you know, it still just strikes me as, again, I'm not blaming people for not saying more, doing more, but I am surprised, you know, 60 years later, why more people didn't do something, say something. Dr. Lloyd shared with you that many African-American elders in the South Side didn't know about the freeway coming through their neighborhood until they literally saw construction equipment in South Minneapolis. These meetings were not well publicized for the 35W public hearing. The public announcement was on page something like 38 of 40 of the Minneapolis Star. It was between classified advertisements for trailer homes. You know, they were not well advertised, but there was at least a few hundred people at the 35W hearing in 1957. So, you know, I wonder if, you know, by way of wrapping up and sharing some final thoughts, if our panelists could give, you know, thoughts about just getting involved, being aware of what's going on, and if being involved matters in these, you know, Jose and Dr. Lloyd, like it seems like there would be a terrible burden if we expected just the most impacted communities to get involved. You know, if we're going to run freeways through BIPOC neighborhoods, is it just BIPOC people who have to get up and be involved in these types of debates? You know, how do we think about this in the present, in the fact that so few people spoke to these issues 60 years ago? How do we think about involvement today?
About the same way they were done before. Just make it honest now, like not unlike before, because you're building something new back in the day. Okay, they thought, and Minneapolis thought we're building something like in LA, you know, like an LA freeway, a parkway with nice trees and flowers along the way, 2-lane highway, beautified and everything. Okay, they laid that real unsullied but unforgiving line to the people of Minneapolis and around the country. And even more so now, it's time to get involved. If you ever want to do something to make a difference in your community, to make a difference in your state or your city, you have to get involved. Talk to your city council member, your mayor, your alderman, your ward. Talk to these individuals. Hold them accountable to ensure that they look out for you, that they're not just running freeways and highways through at the expense of your own well-being, your health, you know, that old heat island index, so that, you know, they're not building highway within 500 meters from not building home 500 meters from a freeway, or not building a freeway 500 meters from a home. In California, it's 100 meters. To be safe, don't live within 100 meters of a freeway.
Yeah.
You got to tell the transportation expert that and hold them accountable. At the same time, you must hold yourself accountable to do that. Because don't sit back and say, well, nobody talked to me. Well, do you talk to them? Let's go both ways now. In the 21st century, communication has always been a two-way street. So now it is more so that in 2023. And let them know that you still hold the vote to keep them in power. If they don't listen to you, well then you give your vote to that person who are listening to you. To the mayor, to the governor, to the legislature, to all those public officials, to MnDOT, to Hennepin County, to Ramsey County, to the city of Minneapolis, to the city of St. Paul, and all the other cities around the 11 county metropolitan area. They'll listen to you if you talk loud enough and often enough. Because I think Dr. Cabán can acknowledge that through his own work with Our Streets Minneapolis. How engaging their talk can make a difference.
Thanks, Dr. Lloyd. Dr. Phillips, how about you?
So this is a question I get a lot. I tend to do a lot of public talks about, education, about, representation and things like that. And that's always the question I get is, well, what can I do? What do I do? And, as a Native historian, there are not enough of us to do this work alone. And it can be overwhelming. It's not always fun. It's very rarely fun. At the risk of sounding like a disillusioned millennial, right? But it's work that has to happen, and we can't do it by ourselves. And it's having that support, whether it's sending an email, whether it's finding books, whether it's reading those books, whether it's sharing information, right? Getting involved in all of these different elements of that. And it's the same thing I tell my students, right? I'll have a class of 25 students, and I'm honest with them when I'm like, I can't do this myself. And part of your responsibility is to take what you learn here and apply it elsewhere. Find places in your life where you can take what you learn here and share it and get that information out there. Be part of those conversations. And if you're not part of those conversations, then start the conversations. And that sense of allyship, that sense of community is one of the things that's the most crucial to any kind of advocacy work.
Thank you, Dr. Phillips. Dr. Cabán.
Well, short answer, a lot. At our organization, you're welcome to come out and think about how this is impacting communities by coming out to door knock. We have community ideation and visioning sessions. We have a mobile history museum about Folsom Memorial Highway. There's one coming up about the impacts of 35 and I-94 on the Cedar Riverside neighborhood. And I think, broadly speaking, this doesn't have to live in history. This is an opportunity to gain empowerment through learning, but also activism doesn't have to be a profession. It could just be the click of a button, sending an email, making a phone call to decision makers. And then, I think what I found is that the root of finding the motivation to get involved in these efforts and to address these histories and these harms really just boils down to making moral choices and decisions. When we get on the highway, we're driving by communities and through land that was basically overtaken in a racist way to create segregation and displacement. What does it mean to you to be able to get through that right away a little bit more slowly so that community members can enjoy the same amenities that you might have been enjoying as a white person living in an area that was protected by a racial covenant for a couple of generations? What does it mean to you to make the decision to go engage with these communities and try to uplift your neighbors in addition to uplifting your own neighborhood and yourself and your family? And then I think just as importantly, obviously something that we didn't talk about a whole lot, but part of the reason these justifications for destruction are made so easy is because these communities are sort of demonized. They're sort of presented as criminals or folks who engage in illicit activities that are not worthy of this sort of human treatment. It's like, starting to imagine these communities not as how they were portrayed as subhuman, but just starting to imagine them as fellow human beings who deserve to live in the same way and have access to the same resources and amenities that people of privilege have enjoyed for these generations, and fighting for that simple sort of outcome for them to get the opportunity to enjoy life in the same way that you have. And if that means something to you, and if that's something that gets you thinking about stepping out of your comfort zone and making a phone call or going out to door knock or sending an email or reaching out to a decision maker, or perhaps looking beyond the idea that we have to live with freeways and perhaps imagining a world without highways, then you will surely find a way to get involved.
Thanks so much, Dr. Cabán. I'm going to turn it over to John Crippen to wrap it up here. I just want to thank all of our panelists one more time, and thank all the people who contributed to the Human Tool Public History of 35W. I'll name them again. Dr. Lloyd, of course, Janine Gilmer's on the line. Heidi Adelsman is here. Bruce Bremer from the community helped as well. Cindy Booker, Sterling Rucker, and many other students. As we often, my colleagues and I teach in heritage studies and public history, we don't seek to just research and understand the past. We seek to connect interpretations of the past to big questions that society is grappling with today. And I think, you know, there is no more kind of existential challenge than freeways. Everything from Black Lives Matter to social justice to environmental justice and public health all converge, no pun intended, on freeways. And you know, they deserve our attention, and we need to be paying attention to what's going to be done with them. So thanks so much for everybody. And John, I'll leave it to you for final words.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. And I just want to say thanks to all of our panelists on behalf of the rest of the audience. You've exhibited what we hope to do at Hennepin History Museum, which is have history as a force of good, but also as a really relevant place in people's lives. And you all exhibited in really insightful, wise ways how we can be informed by the past to draw a better future. So I really appreciate how I appreciate what you brought to the topic tonight, but also your approach to it. And as I usually do at the end of these programs, thanks to our members who are in the audience who make this possible, make programs like this possible. In our own small way, we're hoping to be part of that change for the better as well. So thanks to everyone for taking their evening and giving us an extra 10 or 11 minutes.